So hello, welcome to the Expat Pod. My name is James, your host, and today I'm joined by Jodi, and we met through a podcast guesting kind of service where you, I guess, applied to be on the podcast in the same way. I got your information from a podcast service, and they sent me. I wanted to listening to your story to interview you and really understand, what was the motivation for your living abroad. So if you'd like to just share a bit about yourself and where you're from and where you've lived.
Sure. So, James, thank you for having me on your podcast. And Jodi Samuels, I'm originally born in South Africa. At age 18, I came for a gap year program after high school to Isreal. And I met my husband on a street corner. He was lost and asked me if I speak English. And the rest is history. And we had this plan that we wanted to move to Israel, but he had student loans and we didn't have any money. And as a doctor, if you go, South African doctors have a lot of experience, like in emergency training. And he had these opportunities to go work in these Outback places in Australia and New Zealand. So that was the beginning of our journey. So he worked for the Flying Doctor Service. So some of you may have watched like Northern Exposure. US people usually know what that is. And it's like the doctor in the remote location flying in, with the pharmacy deliveries, the mail and messages and whatever else it needs to go, because you're literally the only access to life. And we lived in the most remote places. And we got to really experience parts of culture in both Australia and New Zealand that most Aussies and Kiwis have never, ever seen. Like we got to see real outback life. And I got to see less. My husband got to fly and do much more exotic things. I was stuck much more in these base areas, which were very boring, very hot and nothing to do. But the reward was a lot of money. And ultimately, we got our Australian citizenship out of that, saved money. But then we had like a 2-year plan. And that 2-year got a little bit distracted when we applied for the green card lottery. I don't know if people know about it, but 50,000 people a year can win the diversity visa, where they literally only ask you, not all countries can apply, by the way, like Canadians are not allowed to apply, so which always bothers the Canadians that other people could apply. But they only ask you for your country of nativity, continent of nativity. They ask for very limited information, so it's a really random lottery. But they give a bigger allocation to Africa. And somehow I just know so many South Africans have won this green card. So we thought, okay, we'll go to the US for like a year or two, get work experience. So firstly in Australia, we lived in all over. I think we lived in 9 cities, I should say towns, villages. Most of them were really small. But ultimately, we lived in Tasmania, the famous little island of Australia, Tassie Devil, and we went from Outback to Tassie Devils to every part, landed up in Sydney, moved to Manhattan, where my husband decided to give up on medicine. And he started studying his MBA while he was doing this crazy medicine. And he got offered a job. We came to visit Manhattan for a conference. And someone offered him a job, and he got offered a job in a pharmaceutical company in no time at all. We'd moved to Manhattan. We had the green cards. We thought we'd stay for a year or two. And that turned into 16 years. I guess along the way, my husband still always had this dream of going to Israel, Zionism, idealism. I'd become a princess, and I was quite happy with my life in Manhattan. And he was working at the time for an Israeli company. So we had the opportunity in the summers when our kids were off school, we'd go to Israel for 2-3 months. I thought that was the perfect solution, keep my Manhattan life. But he always wanted more. And I know this sounds really, really crazy to people, especially given the current situation with the war and everything going on. But we were in Israel in the summer of 2014, when it was the first time Hamas was sending her rockets. Now, Israelis just deal with life so differently. You just cannot imagine that, if rockets that are coming and that are totally meant for your annihilation, carrying on going out. And I just very distinctly remember the first night Hamas sent rockets was at 10 o'clock at night, and it was World Cup soccer. And the Israelis are completely, like, absolutely and totally soccer mad. And I can't remember if it was a quarterfinal or a semi-final, but everywhere the bars are open on the streets and big screens and everyone's watching. And I remember the game was at 11 p.m. and we spoke to friends and we're like, no one's going to go, are they? Like, I mean, a rocket that just came in. And they were like, no, everybody's going to go. And we went out and life just continued. And pretty much that's how life is in Israel. It doesn't matter what's going on. We just continue living. And I think I saw something in that trip when I was there, like just living in a meaningful society where people really get what the concept of living is and living in the moment, but appreciating your blessings. And I just saw like a good part of society. And I thought, I want my children to have these values as opposed to like just living in Manhattan, which is a good life and it's a fun life, but maybe a little bit valueless, or you really have to search it out there. It's not like finding you have to go find it. And that was when we decided, and after 22 years of talking about moving to Israel, we moved in 2 weeks. And so after all the fights, and somehow we seem to do all these things, because in Australia, after 4 years of waiting to get like our citizenship and everything, I literally had my citizenship interview, got my Australian passport, and exactly 4 days later we moved to New York. And then we were in New York, and somehow we do these things really quickly. And we decided we wanted our kids to be here for the start of a school year, and we moved to Israel without a lease, without anything. We moved into like a furnished apartment, brought some suitcases. We didn't even bring a lift over or whatever. And I thought I'd come for a year and I would check out a year. And I joke that I'm 9 years into my 1 year journey of being in Israel. So I was like, oh, I'm just going to check it out. I'll see. And we still had our place in Manhattan and we still kept our jobs. And I think in a way, being able to work remotely has allowed us to still have two lives. And when you come as a Jewish person, you're entitled to live in Israel. You don't have to go through like the usual passport applications and everything. Along the way, I've definitely given up my South African citizenship. I mean, I can always apply for it again, but it's not really the most attractive country right now. Crime capital, economic issues, to try and keep it relevant. And I have my Australian passport, and we got our US passports because eventually green cards become passports, citizens. And now we have Israeli citizenship. And I know it sounds crazy, but we're trying to get EU citizenship by virtue of grandparents from Lithuania. And some people say, why do you need another passport? And I sort of feel like we live in a world that, especially as Jews, or you never know what your future is, another passport's always helpful.
Completely. Well, what a great kind of synopsis of your life. It's a lot to package up into a couple of minutes, but we'll get into the how you kind of got abroad in the first section. So welcome to section 1 of the podcast, all about getting there. So Jodi, you have shared already a lot about the hows and whys briefly in the introduction. I guess initially for you it's the moving to Israel for your year abroad. Were you actively seeking to go to Israel when you were 18? Was that somewhere you wanted to go and visit?
So I'm like, it was all very accidental because I grew up in a family who weren't very affiliated to Judaism at all. I sort of grew up in a neighborhood that was Jewish, but my family's connection was not really much. But I happened to meet a cute guy on the bus on the way to school, and he asked me if I was going to go to synagogue on a Friday night, which, we do synagogue Friday, Saturday for us, Isreal. And I was not at all involved, but I was a cute guy. And I started going to synagogue because of this cute guy, and I got more involved in like Jewish life. And a lot of the kids that I became friends with then were going to Israel after high school. And in those days, like family, people didn't really send their kids unless you came from like an Orthodox Jewish home, which I definitely didn't. And I had to work really hard to convince my parents to let me come to Israel and take off a year. And as far as they were concerned, I was wasting my life. And they finally agreed. So that's how I landed up in Israel, because I think if everybody else was doing it, it was cool. It wasn't like coming from like a major idealistic. It was like, if they can get a year off before they go to university, why can't I? When you live in Israel, there's always dramas. So at the beginning of my gap year, I'm going to age myself, but the Gulf War broke out. And in those days, Israelis didn't have like bomb shelters and everything. And it was like the first time it was those Scud missiles, that it was like the very first version of a missile that Iraq was sending into Israel. And I just remember being a tourist with no family, being whatever, terrified. And I landed up going to England with a friend. And it was like just a bit of a crazy journey, because I landed up getting hosted by a Holocaust survivor who hosted me in her home, because we were like these students from Israel. And she became a mentor and very influential in my life and her story. And it was the first time I really started to truly understand like my Jewish identity. And I came back to Israel and I got more involved in Jewish life. So I can't say like I went to Israel because it seemed like, well, fun, and my parents weren't going to let me going backpacking around Europe on my own or something like that. So that was my alternative.
Wow. And obviously being Jewish back then, did you need anything in terms of a visa or a travel card to get into Israel from South Africa?
Everybody can get a tourist visa to come to Israel, unless you're on Israel's, like, I guess, watch list or terrorist list or whatever else. But generally, you can get a visa pretty easily to come to Israel. It's not a visa, it's just like an entry. However, it gives you like a 3-month stay, and then you have to renew it. So when you come for like a gap year every 3 months, in those days, it was all done by like standing in a very long line, waiting with very long bureaucracy to renew every 3 months your paperwork. Now it's a lot simpler because it's just, I guess, a lot more online and that. So when you get into Israel, if you land in Israel straight away, they just give you like a biometric ticket, like it's got your face ID and everything. And it says for 3 months, but you can renew it pretty easily. And if you want to live in Israel, it's a bit harder, because you actually have to prove the law to live in Israel is you have to have at least one Jewish grandparent. So it was defined on the law that Hitler used. Hitler defined people as Jewish if at least one grandparent was Jewish. So if you had one Jewish grandparent, that earned you a ticket to the gas chambers, and in Israel that gives you the right to live here. So a lot of people aren't technically Jewish or living Jewish lives, and we saw this with a lot of Russians who had Jewish heritage that they could prove, but sort of in no way were really Jewish. But when the war started, they could get citizenship in Israel. And most countries, this is something where Israel differs, most countries, you first have to get permanent residency, and then you have to live in a place. First you have to get there, prove your right to permanent residency. Like in Australia, it took us forever because you have to prove you have enough points, and we didn't have enough points. But then when I finished my degree, I had enough points, and then we could apply, and then the whole process. And then you still have to live in the country for a certain amount of days. My husband actually left Australia before he had to start his job, before he got the days, and he never got his citizenship. And we thought, we'll go back to Australia, and we never did. But I got the citizenship, so now he's dependent on me if we ever want to go back to Australia. But in Israel, you get your citizenship as you arrive. If you've proven before that you're Jewish, you can get your citizenship immediately. You're entitled to all the rights of a citizen on arrival.
That's incredible. And then is your husband, is he South African as well?
Yes.
So you were on the same trip, effectively?
No, he was there doing a medical elective as a student, and he was looking for a bus. And in Israel, English isn't the first language, and every time he asked someone, he didn't know where he was going. They kept giving him different directions and not understanding. So he asked if I spoke English.
Was that, did he ask you in English or did he ask you in Hebrew? Or
No, neither. I mean, to be honest, I've been living in Israel 9 years, and I still can't speak much Hebrew. Neither can he. He asked me in English.
And then did he stay in Israel after you went back, or did you then start dating and then go back to South Africa, or what was the the journey together in that sense?
So, like I joked that he picked me up off a street corner, and I actually was crazy story, but I was actually engaged to someone else. In all my young idealism, I had met some guy that was the most interesting, idealistic person. I guess he was just opposite of what I'd grown up in South Africa, and everybody was dead against this relationship. And here I am, all of 18, like newly religious, engaged to this guy. And in those days, you couldn't really speak to your parents. Like, it wasn't like now, in a WhatsApp call, you called home reverse charges for like 5 minutes and it cost a fortune. And they were like, you are not marrying him. And they were like dead against it. And this Holocaust survivor woman who was at the time living in Israel was dead against it. Everybody was against this relationship. And I was busy sharing with my friend, sitting on a street corner eating, my troubles in life, all of my 18-year-old, and this guy walked up and asked me if I speak English. And then he told me he was a medical student, and I knew another medical student who was this like tall, dark, handsome guy. And I was like, just in case it doesn't work out with the fiance, I'll talk to this guy just in case, because, I could get maybe the backup plan is his brother. So I actually gave him my number just in case, because I thought just in case it doesn't work out. And then I went back to South Africa for a few weeks, and he had finished his elective and he knew I was going back. And he called me, and I'd broken up with this other guy in the meantime. I'd gone back to South Africa just for a few weeks, but I realized, actually, my parents might have been right about one thing, and this wasn't really going to work. I felt like, I don't know how to say it, but the first day I arrived back, and I know this sounds very South African and privileged, but in South Africa, especially in those days, everybody had maids in their home. You didn't have to be rich to have a maid. Everybody had a maid. I'd come home and the maid walked in with a tray of tea, and I just realized this life that I was going to live with this guy was so foreign from anything I knew. It might have been all idealistic and everything, but it was totally a different world. And it was like in that moment I felt like I'd been a puppet in a play, and the curtain came down and I was like, okay, next act. I've ended it with him, and that's when my husband called me a few weeks later, and I guess he was just from a much more familiar environment. He was South African, and he was also from the Jewish community, and he spoke English. And my parents, while they still weren't keen on me getting married young, and as far as they was concerned, I'd been kidnapped by a cult, become religious and everything. At least he was South African, and he spoke English, and he was a doctor. So I ticked some of the things, and then we moved soon after we got married for the first adventure, which was Outback, New Zealand, and then Australia.
So then going to New Zealand, I guess you were going on your husband's visa, or how did that kind of manifest?
In both Australia and New Zealand, countries that are quite hard to get into, because they have areas of work that are considered work shortages, you can get visas to go to those places pretty easy. The thing is, and you can even apply, the problem is the way it works, like in Australia and New Zealand, if you go work in these outback places where they're short of doctors, they approve you to get a work visa, but it's limited to work in these places. In other words, Sydney or Auckland, that has plenty of doctors, your work visa is only approved in what they call area of need. So you're forced to live in these outback places. And then eventually, we managed to qualify for permanent residency. We didn't apply in New Zealand. Once you have Australian citizenship, by the way, you have the right to work and live in New Zealand. So it sort of gives you de facto the other country. But we applied for our permanent residency while we were on medical visa. The challenge is, for 4 years, he worked in these so-called areas of need. And I was eventually going to lose my mind in some of these places, because he worked in some towns where, I just remember as an anecdotal story, he was working all these long hours. You can't even have a beer because you're sometimes the only doctor for a large radius, and you're on 24/7 for 3 months at a time, and then you rotate. And they don't have anyone to send. You're literally in the middle of nowhere. They don't have a relief doctor. He couldn't even go to his brother's wedding when he was in one of these positions because they couldn't find a relief. And I remember saying to him, please just take me for a drive. And we went like 20 minutes in one direction, and he wasn't allowed to go more than half an hour from the hospital because he had to be on call. And it was like, we saw rocks and stones, and it was like very outback, dry desert Australia. And then we went 20 minutes the other direction. And, in those days, like certainly those places, they didn't have cable TV or whatever. And I thought I was going to go like absolutely crazy. So it became hard. The first few places you go and it's an adventure, and then it became very hard to live in these outback places. Fortunately, we moved to a place called the Gold Coast, which is south of Brisbane. Now it's quite a big city, but then it wasn't so big, but that was still considered an area of need. So then finally we moved to like a slightly bigger place and had a bit more of a life. And then we moved to Sydney once we got our permanent residency, and then he wasn't restricted by where area of need was as a doctor. And then he gave up being a doctor after all that, and he studied an MBA.
Before you moved, obviously the first posting he got given, did they help him find, or help both of you find accommodation, or did you have to find that once you knew where you were going to live?
So all the placements, every single placement we had as a doctor was pretty easy in terms of they gave you accommodation. They had like doctor's residence. The thing is, in some of these places, they're so desperate to get a doctor that they give you a lot of incentives. They give you a car. They give you an apartment. I mean, we're kosher, so we didn't eat like the food, but you could eat the hospital food or, I guess canteens food, and they give you big tax breaks, which is the incentive to go work there because you earn a good salary with like these incredible tax breaks for working where basically no Australians choose to work because it's really so remote. So yeah, like this just, they made it very easy. What they didn't make easy was the ability to go from working in an area of need to working in a non-area of need. That was where your challenge. You could only do that if you were a permanent resident.
And then what was, I guess, going from New Zealand to Australia, was it quite a seamless transition because of the job your husband had?
I mean, I think coming from South Africa to New Zealand and Australia, they're probably as like similar cultures as you'll get in terms of their, like, I guess, very British Commonwealth influence. I think for me, more than the culture was so different because we were living in these small towns and outbacks. I think the biggest place that we lived we lived in a place called Invercargill, which is right at the South Island of New Zealand. That was our very first place we went. And then we went, all these small little towns where, especially they'd never met a Jew before. That was already a culture shock, and we had accents, and they weren't used to outsiders, foreigners, and sort of everybody knew it was just the doctor that was the outsider. So you were like known as the doctor and the doctor's wife in a lot of these places, but we never really were like part of the community. And I just remember once like going to, it was like a mining town, one of the placements, and we get there, and one of the nurses said, there's 2 pubs in town. She's like, one's the rough pub, don't go there, go to the other pub. We went to the pub because there was really nothing else to do, like literally. And we walked in, and it was like exactly like a scene from the movies with these guys wearing their like singlets, vests, sitting there drunk over the counter, and kids sleeping on the floor and people playing pool. And we walked in, and my husband wore glasses in those days, and he walked to the counter, and the bartender was like, hey, 4 eyes, what the ... do you want here? And that was like, welcome to the town. And I think like just being an outsider was hard in those places because they didn't know how to deal with an outsider. And then when they realized you were the doctor and the doctor's wife, you got like respect, but not included. And then we lived in like Tasmania, which was like a little bit bigger, more similar. And then when we moved to like Sydney, Sydney was very similar to say like a South African style culture and lifestyle. So it really depended whether it was like city or outback.
Sounds like Crocodile Dundee, like the scene.
Oh my gosh, it was totally. It was like, imagine that, but like even... yeah, totally remote.
And then obviously the green card visa, the green card lottery, sorry, which you won for the States. What was that process like applying for it? Because obviously it's very lucky that you won that, so able just to ship off, I suppose.
How did I even know about it? It wasn't even like we were thinking of moving to America. I was reading The Economist magazine, and at the back of The Economist magazine there was an ad, apply for US green card diversity visa. Like in those days it was like literally you had to mail it in, and I put it in the mail, and I don't know, you did in those days lots of things in the mail, like you could win something and you applied for some, I don't know, whatever, and you put your little coupon in the mail and whatever, and you forgot about it. And There was like literally, I think all they asked for, continent of nativity, your full name and address. That's all they like really asked. They don't ask any real identifying information outside of that because it's supposed to be a completely random. I remember it happened to be our anniversary, and I can't tell you if it was a year later, 6 months, I have no context of the time. My husband came home and he had an envelope, and I thought, oh, it must be a gift card to something. And I opened the envelope and it was like, it said, you've won green cards. That's where so it said you've won green cards, but then that's when the hard work starts. So once you've actually been selected, then they give you a list of like 20 things, and you have to, besides getting like police clearances, and you have to prove like everywhere you've lived and copies of this and birth certificates and everything. You also, I just remember it was one of the hardest things for us, which you had to go for a medical. And you could only go for like a medical at one of their US approved, I guess, embassy like connected medical centers. And at the time, it was like a fortune of money for us. And we had to pay so much. And I remember thinking then, like just this whole process of the paperwork. Oh, you also had to find, I think, a sponsor or someone who would stand by you. I had a cousin living in America who I'd never been in contact with, or like for 20 years I hadn't been in contact with him. Reaching out to him and asking him if he would be agreeable to, I don't know if it was a sponsor, but there was some reason we needed some connection to someone in the US. But there was a lot of steps that you had to take. And I remember being like, yeah, it's all very random to win it. But how many people, it was like, how many people of you were in deep, dark Africa and you were illiterate would even be able to know there's this opportunity to enter this lottery? I mean, it was very skewed when you're advertising at the back of an Economist magazine. You're skewing who you already trying to get it as your randomized sample. And then the requirements to actually be able to qualify for the visa meant that a lot of people wouldn't be able to qualify, whether it was the cost of the application or how much details they required. There were just things that I remember thinking was random-ish, not random totally.
Yeah, as well, there's an unconscious barrier to entry, or probably quite a conscious one maybe from the US side. But
And then, when you go through the whole process, it took about a year. And then once you get your green card, you have to, you have to actually go, you get like a stamp in your passport, and then you have to go, I think it was within 6 months, you have to go and validate it. And then you get like, in those days, it was like a physical green card. And you got the green card, which was then valid for a certain period of time. And you would have to live in the country for up to, it takes 5 years living there to convert it to citizenship. But so you have to be the majority of 5 years in continuous blocks. However, they do have this thing. So a lot of people get these green cards, but then they lose them. So his brother, after we won it, was like, wow, I'm also going to do this. And believe it or not, he also won a green card. And he put the whole process in action. They got their green cards. But you have to enter the US at least once a year, and you have to prove that you have intention to live in the US. So the idea is that you can't hang on eventually. Now, you always hear these stories of some people that had a green card for 20 years and they never ever lived in the US. But you're supposed to, like, at some point open a social security number and go through the whole process. And his brother only came in very infrequently to the US, and he actually lost his green card. But after we received it, we happened on the trip that we went to validate the green card was when he happened to meet someone who happened to offer him a job, and like we moved just a few weeks later and we had the green card, so we didn't have that challenge. And and then I guess living there for 16 years was enough time to live the 5 years out to get the citizenship.
And did your husband do his MBA in Australia then, or in New York?
No, he did it in Australia.
It must be a bit cheaper than America, I guess, because it's quite an eye-watering price from what I understand.
And yeah, like absolutely. And not only that, but as someone who was a doctor and he arrived with an MBA, he got offered jobs that like nobody really cared where his MBA was from. He had an MBA, and what was it?
And then when you moved to Manhattan, then was that also, did the company help you with accommodation and everything else when you first arrived?
They gave us allowances. So it was like he moved with Pfizer, which is a pharmaceutical company, big pharmaceutical company. and the benefits were incredible. Like I remember they moved us business class, like the tickets, and we traded in business, like they just gave us the equivalent money of what business class flights would cost. And we traded in it for economy, and we were like, wow, we've just made money. And we went to the vacation before we went to New York. And they gave us money for like loss of sale on car and moving expenses and everything from Australia. And then in America, they gave us like a rental allowance for like, to help us. But we had to find our own place, which in New York is quite the thing to arrive and find a sublet. And, you like sort of, in those days, it wasn't all these Facebook groups and online. You had to literally look in classifieds. We had someone we knew in New York look in the like classifieds in New York. And when we moved in 2000, it was like in the beginning of this like .com boom, and everybody was moving to New York. And if you weren't at an apartment with the deposit and the broker's fee, you couldn't get the apartment. It was very, very competitive. So it was like actually incredibly hard to find an apartment when we got there. We stayed with this friend, and I remember we'd like look online, look in the newspaper, find these ads, and we would split up and both go separately to try see places. And Pfizer was willing to pay the broker fee. So we had that in hand, because the broker fee was like, usually they wanted at least a month's rental and a month's rental up front, which Pfizer helped you with that, because there was a lot of money for us in those days. But we had to like split up and find a place. And if you liked it, you had to put the deposit there. And then it was very insane. But eventually, with a lot of stress and a lot of tears, we found a place.
And had you already had your children at that point, or were they?
No, all my children were born in Manhattan. So, yeah, when we moved, like that was an advantage of moving all these places, because when you move without children, there's a lot more adventure, with a lot less stress. When you go with the kids, especially the older your children are, which made Israel a very different experience, like dealing with a whole pack of, kids is a very different experience than just us. And also, we very much had the, attitude of everywhere we were going was like just an adventure, see, do, conquer, travel, make some money. And we didn't take it so seriously. It's much harder when you have kids. You take the whole concept so much more serious. And I had always wanted to be in America. I had never been to America, like except for this like short little trip before we moved there. And I had this like I'm a world traveler, and I love traveling. And I'd already had the travel bug. So to me, this was just like another place that could be my launching pad to travel. And when you live in Australia and New Zealand, it's really fast. So to go anywhere, even Asia, like can take you 12 hours. New Zealand's like a 4 or 5 hour flight so there's nowhere close. And I saw that like advantage of being in the US, and I'd be able to travel to Europe in a short amount of time, in the Caribbean and South America and Canada. So I saw it as an adventure. So it wasn't as scary when you see life as an adventure, and you're not looking at like so much at the culture and the long term and can I really live here?
Well, it's a great way of looking at it as well, in terms of the opportunity you can get from this new kind of home destination or home pod. You then unlock more freedom around you.
Absolutely. And I also think like Manhattan, probably like London, and there's a few cities like that in the world where a lot of transient people come in and out. They come to work, come for an experience, and you meet a lot of people that are in your situation. When you're going to the Outback and we're living in these places, some of these places people live forever, or they have their families. You go even a place like Sydney or whatever, people have their family structures, they have their community, they have their world, they have their football team, they have, just everything is like, they know what they're doing there. Whereas when you come to a place like Manhattan, you're just one of many new people, but you don't feel out because you knew. You don't feel lost because you didn't have your family to go to. When it's Christmas or a Jewish holiday or whatever. So what if you didn't have your family? No one else had their family. Everybody's like a transplant in the same way.
Yeah, completely. And then your move to Israel with children, how was that how did that manifest? Obviously, you mentioned when your husband was able to get a job out there and for the same company. What was the help for getting your children to move as well? Was that an easy situation?
So I joke, but moving to Israel, I have a child with special needs, my youngest. I say moving to Israel was harder than getting the diagnosis of a child with a disability. It took me much longer to adjust to the news. I think, and knowing that my child had challenges, I felt like this is what God wanted from us. I saw a purpose in this whole journey. I moved to Israel and I was like, why am I living here? What am I doing? This is the most crazy place I've ever been. And Israel is a tough place to move to, and it's very culturally different, incredibly different to any of the other places I'd lived at. By that point, I'd spent, when I was during my gap year when the Gulf War broke out, I'd lived in London for 4 months. I'd lived from South Africa, I'd lived in Australia, I'd lived in New Zealand, I'd lived in America, and people are like, is Israel really that different? And I'm like, yes, it's absolutely the most different place culturally. Besides the language, you don't have language, you have cultures different, the educational system's different, everything's different. There's certain lines that you have in different cultures, and I can give you about 100 examples how different Israel is, but it's just certain ways of interacting. And it was so different. And I always used to joke, I've lived in Manhattan. I'm used to loud people, mad people, rude people, expensive accommodation, tiny apartments, lack of greenery. Israel will be like, you can't even compare. And that's when my mantra became like, God, give me coffee to deal with what I can and wine to deal with what I can't. Because it was like, wow, and I'm usually a very buoyant personality and go-getter. Those first few months, it shook me in so many ways. And the irony was, it was the place that was my Jewish people. It was the place that we prayed for as Jews for 3,000 years to move to. And it was a place because we'd come in the summers. I knew a lot of people. I'd been there. It wasn't so foreign. I came to the same city we had stayed at in the summers. So we'd come for 8 summers for 2 months. So I'd spent 16 months cumulatively in Israel, plus my year after high school. Yet moving there, visiting, I say, is the difference between dating and marriage, was a whole different reality. Because, when you're visiting, you're not opening mail, you're not dealing with the school system, you're not dealing with the medical system. It was just a whole different world.
Yeah, so one big honeymoon, I suppose, is the visiting.
Yeah, it was. Just everything.
What a journey.
Not speaking a language, being a type A person was incredibly hard for me. And you rely on your children to order pizza for you. Suddenly you're going from being this perfectly capable, competent person, and you need your kids to do everything because they learn the language in 3 months, and you still 9 years later, they look at me like, don't you know how to say that?
Well, what an incredible journey you've been on. And we'll dig into a bit more about the social differences in the next section. So welcome to section 2 of the podcast, all about being there. Now, Jodi, you touched a bit about what it's been like to live in all these places in the kind of first section. For me, what was your first impressions of each of the countries you went to live in? So when you got off the plane or you arrived in each of the towns, cities, countries, what did you first feel or think when you arrived?
I think that coming from South Africa, so much of our identity, especially when I left in the 90s, was about crime and the fear and living behind electric fences and barbed wire and carjackings and people carrying guns. And I'd been held up gunpoint before I left in South Africa, literally 4 days before I moved to New Zealand. And then I moved to places that the kids' bike was in their driveways and no gates and no fences, and people didn't lock their cars, and in these small outback places. I think for me, the contrast was the crime and the freedom that people lived with, and how they didn't look over their shoulders, and kids could ride their bike in the street. And Johannesburg, that certainly wasn't the case. If you wanted your kid to go down the road, you took him in a car. It was just the freedom that people lived with. And I certainly, we traveled a lot all over, like in New Zealand, which was my first place. And that was pretty much everywhere. Yeah, even in a bigger city, people just had such freedom. Their life wasn't defined by crime. And I think the second thing coming from South Africa, because I left just as apartheid was ending. So even though I'd come from like a very liberal family and everything, at the end of the day, South Africa had segregation of schooling, segregation of transport, segregation of everything. So it didn't matter how liberal your parents were, they still didn't have to, you still weren't going on a bus with a black person. I think that was the second thing for me, just seeing these like multicultural cities living in complete, harmony together. When I was in the Outback, Australia, it was very white because that's who lived there. But it wasn't, you didn't feel like you were judged by you weren't judged by your color, and you weren't and you weren't fear of crime. And that was one of my husband's concerns, moving to these like Outback places, that wearing her skull cap, the kippah, the Jewish skull cap, like that makes you identifiably Jewish. Like we saw how little people knew about what Jews were when he was working in a hospital in Outback, New Zealand, and the skinheads came in who would typically hate Jews, who are like the doctor with the wee little hat on his head. And anytime anyone they were always in gang fights, came in, they all demanded to have the doctor with the wee little hat. And I don't think he once had an interaction with one of them who said, "Hey, did you ever hear of Hitler?" And he was like, "Yeah." He was like, "Yeah, he wasn't a good guy." But he didn't even seem to, like, he didn't really understand the context. So it was a very simple life that we lived, and no one was judging you on that. But I think for me, the crime was such a fascinating thing. I remember one being exposed to.
And what was that like even going to America, having had that initial change of paradigm, so to speak?
Look, I think we went slowly from small little Outback towns to bigger Outback towns to, like, then we were in a place called Launceston with 50,000, and then we went to the Gold Coast, which at the time had like 200,000. And then we made it to Sydney, which was already a bigger city. And then you get to Manhattan. And Manhattan is like, Manhattan's its own country. It's not even like the rest of America. So, and, Manhattan's just one big smush of people. I remember being there in the beginning and seeing on the subway, I think it was like HSBC or something, the bank, that had an ad like, "We speak your language," 42 languages or something. And that's really like the people who were on the subway. There were people from like all around the world. Your life mixed with everybody and anyone. And you had Puerto Rican Day parades and Dominican Day parades and the Irish Day parade and the Israel Day parade. Like, diversity was celebrated. Whereas I didn't think diversity in Australia was celebrated. Australia was the opposite. Australia was like, we're this big melting pot society, like become an Aussie. It was like Aussie, Aussie, Aussie. And like, as long as you had your Australian football team that you followed, you were Aussie. But in America, it was much more about celebrating diversity and cultures, which I think is one of the saddest things that's happened now. And, how America's changed from anything from Black Lives Matter to the woke movement to the war in Israel and just everything that's gone on in the last, say, 10 years. It's gone from a society that much less celebrates diversity, and everything becomes cancel this, cancel that, protest this, protest that. But I think for me, I loved the fact that they celebrated diversity, and it was completely okay to be Puerto Rican or to be Dominican or to be Jewish. Every subculture, everything was okay in New York. Everything went.
Yeah, it sounds like it's very proud of your heritage, whereas it felt like in Australia, from what you're saying, it's more like, no, we are just, the heritage of Australia is that we are from everywhere, so you're Australian.
No one stopped you. You could be proudly Jewish, but that wasn't your front identity. Was you were Australian first. I went to university in Australia, so I guess I had like understood, like I got culturally assimilated, and as much as you can probably in a university experience, more so than like if you're just working. But it wasn't that Australians were intolerant or against other religions. It was just that your identity was Australian first. Whereas you could be a Puerto Rican American, you could be a Jewish American, you could be an Irish American. It was okay in Australia, you were Australian. You happen to be Jewish or you happen to be Catholic, no one cared, but you were Australian first.
It's interesting how they both have their own takes then, but was it, what you're saying, it's both are still
tolerant in their own way, but
completely. It's both very safe and both very pleasant places to live if you are of those backgrounds or diversities. It's just they have a different lens to view it. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And then Israel, obviously, you spent a lot of time there, going back and forth. Your first impression and living there, you did parry it to marriage and dating, but what was the first impression of having to find a property to live in and all the bureaucracy which might have come across with moving? What was that like as a first impression?
So everything that you ever learned in life, from etiquette to lines to rules to everything, just changes in Israel. It's a complete different culture. It's in no way the same like Western Anglo, sort of British style culture that even influenced America, I guess, in its early days and created the early style culture. It's just everything's different. And I think I found that so overwhelming. From arriving, like the first day we moved into this like furnished apartment and we knew some friends and they said, okay, let's go out for falafel, which is like the food that everybody eats in Israel. And it was just like the takeout store around the corner. And we went and the guy was like, oh, you guys moved here. And he gave us like falafel balls with his hands it was like one of my like first few hours on there. And he's like handing me food with his hands. And I'm like, any other country, you'd have to be wearing gloves and you'd have to be passing this with the server. And he's like, and I remember being just even that, like everything was so different, whether how you were serving food or how you negotiated a lease. Like, no, it's fine, just come. Because the guy we landed up actually getting a lease from, the furnished apartment, happened to be a friend, knew this guy was renting his place. Like, no, just come, it will be fine. Like in another country, you wouldn't just go and be fine. Everything in Israel is done in a handshake. You pay afterwards, not before. And then I think the hardest part is seeing that people just like shout at you. It's very Middle Eastern in that sense. Like people can scream and shout at you about one thing and then give you a blessing 2 minutes later. And already coming from like South Africa and Australia, very polite cultures, I found that like such a big shock. And people want to know your business straight away. Like, who are you? Where did you come? How much do you own? How much are you renting your house for? And there's just certain rules in the way society functions with all the nuances that I could tell you. There's certain rules, like you just don't get in an elevator with someone and say, oh, so you got a good job. How much are you earning? In any other country I lived in, or how much are you paying for your rent? To a perfect stranger. But then at the same time, it's an incredibly warm culture, being that you go and open your bank account and the person who's opening your bank account, it was a Jewish holiday coming up, and they go like, do you have somewhere to go for a meal? Who's going to be, where are you going? Because have you got family here? No, we haven't got family here. Okay, well, if you haven't got family here, then come to me for a meal, to a perfect stranger. So you get like, Israel's a little bit like that. I'll actually share a funny story because I think it says it all. Gavin's sister moved to Israel. And when she was moving to Israel, so when you land, I said, if you're Jewish, you're entitled to get your papers and everything as you land. So you go through this whole process on landing where they give you a temporary passport and you actually get money to move to Israel. They even give you money to help you with your rent and language and everything. You get this basket of services and including cash on arrival. So the woman she's grilling Gavin's sister, like, that's my husband's sister. Like, so do you have family here? Do you have this, that? So she mentioned, yeah, my brother lives in Jerusalem. And, oh, what's your brother's name? Gets his name, where in Jerusalem? Oh, and then we run events for young professional singles. So the woman's like, so are they the people who run events for the singles? So my sister-in-law's yes. She's like, do you think you can get me an invite to their house? And my sister-in-law came her very first Shabbat, the Sabbath, like that Friday night, she was at our house and the lady from immigration came with her. And it's like just only in Israel. Like it's just those kind of things that are so different. There wasn't anything culturally. It's not like one's bad and the one's good. It was just so different in every possible way. Everything's different.
Well, it's an incredible story and one which I've never heard of anything like that before in my life. So it's really quite shows the unique nature of Israel, which is I really want to go visit now and just experience it and drink in the culture.
I mean, I'll give you another example that I think really describes culture because it's just so different. So soon after we were there, my husband was in an accident. A guy on a motorbike, like rode into, like as he was merging into the lane, the guy cut across him and he hit the bike. And it was like the guy fell off his bike. He was fine. He wasn't really hurt, but the police came and took in. And my husband was like, the first thing they came and they're like, okay, everyone's okay, fine. So it took details. Next day, 2 days later, my husband gets a call from some guy and he's like, Gavin, and he's like, you can hear the guy speaks Hebrew and the guy in broken English. He's saying, this is Moshe. So Gavin's like, who's Moshe? He's like, no, I'm the guy from the accident. So Gavin's thinking, oh, hey, why is he calling me? Like, what's he going to, say? He goes, why were you on the whatever highway he was on? So Gavin, well, I go to work that way. He goes, listen, my bike is in the store being fixed. He goes, is it possible that on your way to work tomorrow, you can pick me up and drop me at the store so I can pick up the bike where it's being repaired? And like, just so different. Like, you just could not imagine in another country that you would call the guy that knocked you off the bike. By the way, could you just come pick me up so I can go pick up my bike?
This shows the trust or the community spirit or the nature that...
It's just not the same form of barriers in society that people have, which is a good and a bad thing. Because that same person will scream at you when they're in the mood to give you a blessing 5 minutes later, but it's not the same. Like my husband said when he was working, he said it was like such a hard thing to get used to the culture because he had been working at like Pfizer and it would be, you would have a review feedback from your manager and it'd be like, okay, well, if you made this mistake, next time we're going to do this and this will be the feedback loop and this is how we'll rectify it. He said his first day was in a meeting in Israel and he said something and his boss just said, are you crazy or you mad? Which one is it? And he was like, what did I say? That was so bad. And they like, just say what they think. There's no like airs and graces. It takes a while to get used to. I don't know if I'm ever going to get used to it. I've been here 9 years and I don't know if I'll get used to the culture.
The filter's just gone. Like it's much more effective, I suppose, in business. It's a good efficiency tool. What was it like from what you thought of raising children in South Africa or your childhood compared to your children's in New York? What was the whole situation of having children abroad? How did that feel? Obviously, your families were so far away.
Growing up in South Africa, we lived as sort of white South Africans and then white South Africans in the context of crime. We lived very, very protected lives. Like, we didn't go out. When I was like a teenager, you couldn't go downtown night clubbing because it wasn't safe. And it wasn't safe to get in a taxi and it wasn't safe to do this. And so much of your life was defined by safety. And you also only hung out like in white neighborhoods and places there everybody looked like you, dressed like you, and act like you. It was very much part of apartheid's design, divided, if we can conquer you, united, they wanted us to live in our own little worlds. So I came from a very sheltered childhood in many, many ways. So my children growing up in Israel is like a complete different existence that I probably couldn't even have imagined exist because it wasn't even something I understood in the world was possible. But in Israel, it's an incredibly free society. And I know this always shocks people. I'll go back to like New York and I'll be at the dentist and they'll say, how do your kids find it? I'll say they love the freedom. People imagine Israel being very scary and people living with guns and everything. But you live with that same trust you said, like where people trust people. Your 12-year-old can walk out at night and come home at 2:00 in the morning and be hanging out with their friends or going downtown and nobody worries about them. There's not that kind of crime and sense of worry. We have to worry about terrorism, which is a whole different story, but you don't worry about like day to day about crime. And you don't worry about some drunken guy. I mean, I always tell my daughters or whatever, be careful, a drunk man's a drunk man anywhere in the world. But you're not like hooliganism, behavior, wild people, this kind of stuff that maybe like a bar brawl, that could happen in some places. It's just not so much part of our reality. It's a very safe place for kids and they have a lot of freedom and a lot of independence. So I think that is very different. My kids were born in New York, so I really had the understanding of what it was like to have kids who were in Manhattan who had much more freedom than they would have had in South Africa. But there's a lot more, things that you worry about in society. And then coming to Israel, they just had so much freedom, things that I would never have let them have the freedom in New York until they were older to do. Having no family was different because the first time we had any family was after 23 years of living abroad.
Is that when your husband and sister moved to
Israel? Yeah. And she didn't even move to the same city. So, I mean, we see her, but it's not like she's a neighbor, and we see each other all the time. So, yeah, we never really had any family where we were living. And maybe because that was just our reality, we didn't move with kids. And we were so used to not having kids. And when we had kids in Manhattan, everybody there was transplants. All our friends didn't have family. So they were our family. I remember when my kids had a significant other day at school, it was one of our family friends who would go because they didn't have a grandparent there. They didn't have any significant other. Was whoever was our good friends.
That's incredible. When you were saying about you go back to New York and you ask, like, your friends ask you, how do your kids find it in Israel where it's obviously safe with guns and things? Well, that's how we see America, which is why it was quite amusing for me to hear that, in the sense of America is like, you always hear it from somewhere worse. But
yeah. It's also like I always say to people, especially now, America, with all the school shootings and everything that happened. I mean, up until this war that happened in Israel, per capita, you have a lot more people killed in America between like all the school shootings and gangs and everything that ever happens in Israel. It all unfortunately changed on October 7th. But, people say to me, but aren't you scared in Israel? And I'd look at them and I go, but aren't you scared in New York? Or aren't you scared in America? And they look at me like I'm crazy. No, America's perfect. Everywhere else is not good.
Yeah, I think it is really interesting to have that. You need to really step away from somewhere to view it back from a different way, which is kind of my I guess my next question is reverse culture shock. I don't know if you've experienced it of your kind of bringing into Africa, or even like countries you visited before and then gone back to or lived in. Have you had a reverse culture shock to like knowing something different from somewhere else, mainly being Israel now and its sense of freedom? Does going back just feel that bit different?
I think the biggest thing that where the reverse culture shock comes in is something called chutzpah, which a lot of people know what that word means, but chutzpah is a word that a lot of like business people now use, but like being audacious and bold and not scared of rules and challenge authority, but not because you're like in an anarchist way that you're going to challenge authority. It's like, well, if it doesn't make sense, I'm going to question around it. Like, if we joke in Israel, like, no is not no. No is a starting point of a negotiation. And I see how much more assertive when I come and people like look at me, and South Africans generally aren't very assertive. One of the things South Africans always say, if you're like in a crowd and you want to get through, you go, I'm sorry, everything. We don't even say, excuse me. Like the language is so apologetic and everything about South Africans is polite and I'm sorry. And I remember when I first moved to Israel and I'd go like deal with bureaucracy, and I have a child with special needs, so she meant I had to deal with a lot of bureaucracy, and Israel has ridiculous bureaucracy. And I would like come out of a meeting unsuccessful and someone would say to me, but did you shout? And I'm like, me? Like, I'm supposed to shout? Like in a government office, I was like horrified. Like, how am I supposed to do that? As I've like gained my assertiveness skills here, I sometimes see when I'm somewhere else and I don't like something, I'm so much more assertive and people are a little bit shocked. And it's come from like just being in Israel. I see this like reverse. I didn't even realize that I'm being assertive. But if something seems stupid or something doesn't make sense, or I'm at a restaurant and something's wrong, and I'm not saying like it's not coming from like a rude point of view. It's just coming from like, well, it doesn't make sense, or this isn't right, or this isn't fair, or this rule is a stupid rule.
It's not beating around the bush, or it's being quite direct in a certain,
Yeah, very. And although that culture confronts me when I'm in Israel, I'm always a little bit shocked that I can use it when it suits me outside of Israel.
And that's one of the great things about traveling and living abroad, though, is you build this toolkit of being able to deal with various social situations which can shock people. So you can be a negotiation tactic in your sense, because you've seen how how people respond in different ways in different cultures. That if you are talking to someone who's not really had that experience, you can throw a sim from left field and they can be disarmed if it is confrontational, or you're not getting maybe what you want from a conversation. You have that arsenal of responses in your back pocket.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I've also traveled to over 90 countries, and my kids have been to like over 50 countries. And I think just the experience of traveling and living make us see the world through like a different set of lenses. Like the joke is when we're like traveling, one of the famous games we played with my kids since they were like little would be like geopolitics. Like if you were caught in an avalanche in a mountain and you could make a call, which embassy would you call? Like, and it would be like, depends which country and which passport would you pull out, and and if you're in a terrorist, which country would you say if you're in a terrorist like hijacking, say on a plane, which country would you say you're from? And and they understand the world, but they see the world through like a big picture lens, not through a small lens. And I think that's the benefit you have of living in different places, for sure, because you really experience cultures. But even just traveling to them, it opens your eyes to like, the world doesn't always see everything the way you do, or they don't always act the way you do, or they don't always think the way you do. And it gives you more open-mindedness to the validity of other perspectives, even if they're not yours.
It's that full kind of macro, holistic approach to everything, and how it's all connected in a certain way, but it's finding the balance, or I guess the combination of things which unlock a successful experience for yourself. Wonderful. And going onto kind of food, then obviously you mentioned you're kosher. What was that like? Kind of traveling the world in all these situations. Did you have to adapt to diets, or
hungry? Well, it's very hard to travel kosher in most places in the world. Depends where you're living. There's different like levels of access to food. If you're in New York, and especially like the northeast of America, there's like countless products that are kosher that in the supermarkets. And South Africa also has a huge amount of kosher product. Like without even going to a restaurant, you can just go to the supermarket. Living in Outback, Australia and New Zealand was very, very challenging, and we ate a very basic diet. And then moving to America, we could have everything, and you had choice of kosher restaurants. And then Israel, of course, almost not everything in the country is kosher, because not everybody is Orthodox, but everything in supermarket products are kosher, and a huge amount of restaurants are kosher. So it's very easy to be kosher in America, and very even easier in Israel. So there wasn't, although what people eat in Israel is definitely different. Like I don't like garlic. And if you don't like spicy and you don't like garlic, beware in Israel, because everything is garlic and everything's spicy. And when they say like you ask for low spice, it's a bit like going to India and you say like, no, I don't want it very spicy. Their version of not very spicy and your version of not very spicy may be very different. And because Israel is a real melting pot of cultures, that, these Jews have moved from all the North African and Arab countries when after the establishment of the state, there was a huge exodus of about 1 million Jews who were kicked out of those countries. Most people don't know that. It's always about the Jews with the Palestinians, but the 1 million Jews who were kicked out of Arab countries, who all brought their very strong cultures and cooking traditions. And a lot of this is still very much celebrated in the cuisine here. So you're exposed to whether it's Yemenite and Iraqi and Moroccan and Turkish and food from so many different countries, which is very different to, say, Ashkenazi Jewish, which is the Eastern European style Jewish food that you typically would have found in a kosher restaurant in Manhattan or Australia. And then, of course, you've got, Italian and all those kind of things that are now kosher, like every version. So food moving to Israel has been like an adventure, not difficult, just an adventure, trying so many different things and having so many opportunities to eat out. And so that's easy. When you travel, we literally will be like the kind of backpackers who go with so many bags because we have to take our food with us, which is crazy. So we have so much food with us when we travel, and we live on a lot of bass and a lot of tuna and a lot of, my kids are like, please tell me I'll never have to eat some tuna fish ever again, and I'll never have to eat another boiled egg and a banana when we come back from traveling, because they're used to eating a very basic diet.
So say, I suppose you didn't go vegetarian whilst you were traveling because you avoided all the meat, and therefore you don't milk and things to you. And
we will eat in a strictly vegetarian place, but a lot of places don't have, like if you go to big cities where there's more sophisticated, you'll have, because we won't eat a place that prepares meat, because we have all these rules about eating meat and milk separate. But if it's a strictly vegetarian place, but you go to like Africa, a lot of, or as soon as you go off the beaten track, once you're out of big cities, vegetarian is not a big thing. It's becoming bigger. It never used to be. Even in Europe, there never used to be so much. Now vegetarian everywhere in big cities. But when you go out of big cities, like we're always using the app, like, will this city have vegetarian?
Did you find you cooked a lot at home more than when you were traveling in certain places, just because of the difficulty to eat out and have that as part of a social life?
I mean, when we were living in Outback parts of Australia, and when I'm saying Outback, I mean that the nearest airport was like a 5-hour drive away. And then you still had to go in like a Jeep to get there, and real Outback. So simple things that you even just need for our Sabbath. Like we have a special bread that we eat. We eat either grape juice or wine, and we only can have a kosher version of those. You can't just get from the supermarket. There was no possibility of getting fresh bread, or there was no possibility of even getting wine that we needed for sacramental purposes. We used to squeeze grapes to make our own, our own grape juice. And even now, when we travel to certain places where they have what they call Chabad houses, Chabad is like one of the sects of Judaism, but they like pretty much are in 85 countries. They say they're in as many places as you can find Coke or something. But I guess we're anywhere that it's vaguely safe for a Jew to be. And they have these like houses where you can often go and get Shabbat meals. But in many of these like off the beaten track places, they have their own ability to make grape juice, and they make all their food. So absolutely, we completely, and then that's the opposite in Israel, because now we can just like buy everything or walk on the street and buy almost anything's kosher.
There's no checking of packaging. It's just, you just know.
Yeah, there's like just so much stuff here that's kosher. I mean, there is levels and levels people keep of kosher and kosher, because there's shades of black in Israel. We joke like there's shades of gray in Israel. Like the black hat Orthodox community all have their own rules about what they keep. But yeah, like we just host, like it's got a kosher symbol on it. But in Israel, it's really easy. In fact, it was so easy between the stress of moving to a new place and the accessibility of like just kosher food whenever I wanted it. I put on so much weight in the first year, because I was like, if I'm going to live here, I'm just going to eat whatever I want. Like, it was like a treat. I could, anytime I'm like, oh, I'm hungry, I can have a croissant, one thing, whatever I wanted. Like, it was just there. In another place, I'd have to like go home and make it.
Yeah, I guess it's the thing of, you can finally have, it's like so accessible that you forget how hard it was before potentially, and
like now we don't even eat out that much, because we're like, oh, how many times can you eat out? Like you get tired of.
Yeah, it's not a treat anymore. Because
yeah, exactly.
Is there anything else you want to? I appreciate we'll be talking for half an hour on this topic. Is there anything else you want to be discussing about the living there, or being abroad?
I mean, I think I'll just mention, and I think it's just really relevant in terms of the context of what's going on in the world, and that Israelis, right now, we're living in absolute parallel existence. Like one side of us is like war with Hamas, but a much bigger fear is that we could have war with Hezbollah, with the north, which would be a far more scary war. While Hezbollah sent Hamas sent something like 15,000 rockets into Israel. Since the war started, Hezbollah has like capability to send about 200,000. And they're much higher payload, far more accurate than Hamas's. And you sort of have this fear of what could happen. and the country prepare you to have like emergency supplies and be prepared for blackouts and be prepared for have like canned food and, food that you can eat. And they prepare the country all the time. But you live day to day, like just so normally. I think I have like special needs kid or go on the street and walk the dog and you go to shows and you go to live everyday life. And they had this big comedy festival and they were all foreign comedians. They all said the same thing, but one summed it up with this. He said, Israelis have this incredible ability to live, love, and laugh and mourn when they need to. But it's a really incredible way to live, like in a stressful moment, and such incredible resilience that you just continue. And I think other countries would be far more fearful, shut down. Can't imagine going to sit in a park in the middle of Central Park, knowing that a missile could land on my head and there's not a bomb shelter. But Israelis just carry on living. And it's been interesting to me, I guess, because I didn't grow up in Israel. And some people, even for this whole generation, they haven't really experienced a war in Israel. They've experienced Hamas sending missiles. I mean, my kids have lived here. We've had 5 rounds of missiles before this war where Hamas would send. But, you have your bomb shelter. You've got the Iron Dome, Israel. This is a whole different reality you're living in now. And a whole different level of fear that's penetrated society for the first time. But in spite of fear, people just live. And I think it's a really interesting for me as an observation because having lived in other cultures, I can't imagine other cultures living to the extreme, to the same way Israelis do, and the resilience and the ability to adapt. So I think that for me has been really interesting as a world traveler and someone who's lived in multiple places, just to see the resilience and the adaptability and the absolute focus on just living for today.
I think that's the thing as well. It's like the true, victims of the situation is the civilians on both sides. It's the civilians of no matter where you are. It's people who have to go to work or go to school, or if you own a restaurant or whatever. It's you're effectively helpless. But the fact that all these people in Jerusalem or in Israel are just going to support that restaurant, or their entire economy is kept going. Someone's like, well, I still want to go to shops, I still want to go to cinema, I still want to go watch the football or whatever. It's incredible.
I mean, a lot of Ukrainian Jews moved to Israel with the start of the war. I mean, they had a huge Jewish population there, and Israel absorbed 70,000 Ukrainians in a very short period of time, which on a proportional level to the size, the comparative size of the country, it would have been like in a few months, America absorbing about 5 million Ukrainians. And so we have a lot of Ukrainian people around who were there at the beginning of the war, and they say how different it was to be in Ukraine and to be in Israel during wars with similar kind of attacks happening.
Yeah, I guess it's quite interesting though, because it must be awful for them to have fled a war to then find themselves in a similar situation. You just can't imagine the stress of it all and the
irony of it all.
But yeah, hopefully things do find peace soon. Well, the world is just full of few people with power and make it quite difficult for everyone else.
And I just think everybody should, and I think this doesn't happen in the world right now. People only see the world through their own set of eyes, their own echo chamber, their own, social media universe. And there are so many different realities in the world and so many different perspectives and so many different cultures. And there's so many different ways of the world seeing right. And just because your social media world or your university or your peer pressure or whatever, or this march got 200,000 people, my favorite thing is just because it's on TikTok doesn't mean it's true, and it doesn't mean it's right, and it doesn't mean it's the only view of the world. And I just challenge every citizen of the world to get out there and not go stay in the Sheraton and go in your taxi to the Sheraton, but go travel to countries, see the people, experience the people, taste the food, catch their public transport, have a conversation with people. Because you'll see that there's so many different ways of seeing the world, and it's not always only your way.
Completely. I think that's That's why I started this podcast as well. Is that I want to share people's stories because I've only lived in Sweden and the UK. I've travelled a lot. I've been to America. I've been to lots of the world. I've been to Asia and various places. But there's more people who've been to more places, and other people who've travelled to South America, and people from Africa, and people and they've all got different perspectives and different stories because they've all lived in different times in different places, or had different jobs, or made different friends, and you're right, you have all these paradigms, or you gain so much empathy from it, all the diversity which is in the world. It's a pretty big place, and you start to think, well, actually, I've never thought of it that way. I've never seen that side of the story, and then you start to be a lot more considerate with their actions because it's not just from a single viewpoint. The more viewpoints you get to see.
And I think that's the scariest thing about the world right now, whatever anybody's perspective is. There isn't like another side anymore. For all the social media and all the transparency and all the everything, we live in a world where people only sort of really hear, see, and think one view of reality. And
well, it's polarized. If there's a topic to discuss, it's right or wrong. It's it's either 1 or 0, as opposed to no, it's probably a spectrum. Everything is a spectrum. Literally the sound, light. Everything we see and feel is a spectrum. That's why waves exist in physics. It kind of proved that point and it expanded to everything else because the fundamental building blocks of life as we perceive it is a spectrum. So there's no such thing as a binary force. I think we've exhausted this topic, so let's go into section 3. So welcome to section 3 of the podcast, which is a review of your time. So Jodi, if you could go back to when you first moved abroad, what would you tell yourself, or what bit of advice would you give yourself, which would then live with you throughout your incredible journey?
I would say, don't be scared of experiences. I think when you first go to places, your natural instinct is to try stick with what you know. And whether it's moving to a country or visiting a place, just be willing to try new things, new experiences, new connections. I wish in the beginning I would have been more open-minded to that. I would have learned so much more.
Is that something you tell your children as well if they went to live abroad themselves?
Yep, I tell my kids that, and I would also tell them that just remember being born, who you are, what you are, where you are, to the right maybe coloured skin parents, to the right country, to the right year, is all makes it not privilege but responsibility. And that responsibility is to see the world through a set of eyes that maybe other people don't have the privilege of seeing, and to lead a life that's responsible because of that. Not to confuse privilege with responsibility.
That's a good I guess paradigm to look at for. I've never actually thought of it that way, which is ignorant of me, I suppose, but it's very true. I've always said that I won the lottery the day I was born because you literally can't control
exactly
your kind of your origin point in life is a bit that you have no control over. After that, you have some control how you respond to the impulses in life, but you don't know where you start. You just start, and yeah, if you are lucky enough to be in a certain experience of privilege, and that's also quite a spectrum as well, then yeah, you should really be responsible for that, and I guess an advocate or some kind of pioneer for change and hopefully inclusion, which is probably something which we don't have enough of. What would be your favourite moment? It's quite a lot of moments, but if you have one favourite moment in your kind of career of travelling, what would it be?
I think it's probably the most defining moment for me was when we moved to New York. I really was overwhelmed, and I actually didn't want to move to New York. I was quite happy where I was. And firstly, I didn't want to move when we moved from New Zealand to Australia. And then I didn't want to move from Australia to New York. And I remember my husband was working in Midtown, and I was going to meet him. We were going to go somewhere, and I was meeting him. We made a landmark meeting place in the lobby of a hotel, Pennsylvania. And I had called a doctor to make a doctor's appointment. I was maybe been there a week or less. and they asked me, what's my zip code, my postal code? And I didn't know it. And my husband found me like in a crumpled heap, sitting in the lobby, hysterically crying. And I was like, to me, it just represented how I'd had a life in Australia and I'd had a job and I had friends and we had a house. And I was like now in this big, scary city. And I was starting from scratch and I was so devastated. I was like, everything. I didn't even know what my zip code was, but it represented to me how ground zero my life was. I'm going to have to start from scratch. When I look back at that, I laugh like, I'm probably one of the most connected people I know. And, and I public speaker and I run events and communities and social media followers and everything. People laugh when I tell them that story. But I think that like sort of defines, we all start somewhere and that doesn't mean where we end up.
Well, no, and I guess there's kind of there's two ways of seeing that. Is you have like the kind of first line of knowing where you are, which is the bit you struggled with just then in your story, but then you expand that to your global connectedness is that is the blessing of traveling, or the trade-off of traveling is that you do lose a lot of local friends initially when you first move because you don't know anyone, but then you gain so many people internationally and you get so many cheap holidays because you know someone who lives somewhere else.
Or as I say, when you have an apartment in Manhattan or Jerusalem, two of the most expensive cities in the world, everybody wants a free vacation.
I guess going on to that, making friends whilst you've been abroad, what was been your kind of your silver bullet for doing that since you've been traveling so much? Is it the kind of finding places to practice your religion, or has it been finding sports or other parts of your kind of personality which you find linked with other people?
I think two things. One, when we were like living in the hospital residence in New Zealand, we were 1,200 kilometers away from the closest Jewish community. But I remember the other foreign doctors were so amazed that there was like a rabbi, a leader from a Jewish community, cared about these like Jewish people living 1,200 people away. And they were like the priests in the church around the corner wouldn't even know who I am. And I think there's like this incredible connectiveness between Jews around the world that we look out for each other. So that absolutely 100% helps because you can always arrive somewhere. And I think you said you had that as an experience going to working summer camp, and like you will always have a place and people open their homes and you'll always have a place for a meal and you will always be welcome. That makes it so much easier to move somewhere because you do know that not only can you walk into a synagogue, but like it's sad that now because of all terrorism and that, it's become people are so much more suspicious and you have to have security before you walk in. But I think overall, as a Jew, you can go anywhere in the world and you know that you have like a kind of extended family. So that for sure helps moving and making friends and building a community. I would say the other thing, and I hear this from so many people, and I feel this all the time, but if you wait when you move to a place for people, you might wait for a very long time because people's lives are busy and people don't necessarily think. But if you invite people over, you immediately become a friend. Invite someone for dinner. And the second you do this, it's amazing. You break barriers, you make friends, and you build connections. And we've always just been this kind of family. We can be somewhere 2 weeks and we're already inviting guests. And right now, the US embassy employees, a lot of them live in my neighborhood. I've just like randomly reached out to people and invited them over. And they were like, wow, it's so amazing. I've been on placements in so many different countries. And nobody ever like just, we're hanging out with other embassy employees, but like random people didn't just invite us to come to their house for a meal. And they go, since we're in Israel, so many people reach out to us. And I think that just the concept of reaching out to people, instead of waiting for people to reach out to you, makes it just so much easier to build your friends and your community and break barriers.
Completely. And one thing I noticed was, you're the person who's different. You're the one who's moved in. Everyone else has already got settled friendships. The life exists already there before you arrive.
And they've got their routine and their kids' sports game and their jobs and whatever they have and their family responsibilities.
You got to either shoehorn your way in or crowbar if you have to. But you're right with the invitations and I think housewarming is a really good way of, I guess, delivering up.
I truly believe that opening your house is different to saying to someone, should we meet for a coffee? There's something about opening your home that just is a whole different level of breaking barriers and creating relationships. Because a coffee, you can meet and walk out afterwards, and that's just that, a coffee. But inviting someone over to your home opens the opportunity for friendship.
Yeah, I think it shows the vulnerability you're willing to just give up. Is this is where I live. Being vulnerable just to someone, which is part of the negotiation of friendship as well. Is what are we doing for each other? And yeah, that's a great bit of advice for sure. I guess the last question is there anything else you want to share about your life abroad and your experiences in all these places, or your family's experiences?
I think that it's challenging, but the challenges can be broken. And I mean, we've moving to a place with I have a child with Down syndrome. And, we had to navigate another system. And every experience is what you make of it. Every challenge is how you deal with it. And it can be the same if you go traveling. You'll be like, it rained the whole time, and this was so expensive, and the hotel wasn't good. Or you could be like, wow, I experienced this amazing culture, and we tried the food, and people were unbelievable. And I would say that's about living the same attitude as living abroad. You take yourself with you when you move abroad, and you take your attitude with you. And your attitude is everything in how that experience is going to be.
Yeah, I think I tried to practice a lot of mindfulness, and more so when I was living abroad, because it was difficult. So the things I wanted were harder to get. So I was like, well, I need to be more thankful and grateful, and have more gratitude for what actually I have, and that's a good job, and living in the right place, all this other stuff.
Attitude of gratitude.
Exactly. It's such an easy thing to implement in certain ways. It's difficult to do well, but it's the whole point of showing up every day will then make it better in the long term, or easier in the long term. So my girlfriend's very good at telling me to be more grateful. So I'm hopefully getting better at it. But on that note, I just want to be thankful for you for sharing your time with me, and obviously sharing the difficult story that you're living in, and if you want to share anything more from what you do in your work as well.
Sure. I mean, I wear many hats, from business consulting to running these events for young professionals, which I do as a not-for-profit. And I'm also a disability activist and speaker, and I speak on this topic all over the world. So, but I do speak. I've been writing blogs for many years about my crazy life, having traveled a lot and lived in all these countries and hosting these unusual guests in my home from all around the world. And I say we get to travel in our living room by hosting different groups of people all the time. So I think that I've had some level of a unique experience. And people used to say, put your blog into a book. And then I wrote a book called Chutzpah, Wisdom and Wine, The Journey of an Unstoppable Woman. And it's available on Amazon. And it's a fun, light read with lots of lessons for everyone. So, and it's definitely, it doesn't matter whether you're Jewish or not Jewish. It's a very relevant book. And I would love you to connect with me, to follow me on Jodi's Voice on social media, as well as I have a website and an email list. But also say to you, this invites to every one of these people out there listening, if you should be brave enough to come to Israel, and I promise it's not as scary as it sounds, but if you should be brave enough to come to Israel and open-minded enough to check out a place with an open set of eyes, you would be more than welcome to be one of the guests at my home.
Well, that's so kind of you, and I'll put the links in the show notes, and I'll post it on social media when the show goes out for everyone to go and find you and get in touch, and hopefully we might make a new connection in that way as well, which is wonderful. So yeah, but thank you for your time and your openness. I think is the main thing, that you been so transparent with everything, which is not easy to do. So yeah, thank you for sharing. It's the reason this podcast works so well is you meet so many people like yourself who are going through difficult times, but also, you know, with great stories and great learnings. And yeah, thank you.
No, thank you for the opportunity.
And as always, we'll see you for the next time with the Expat Pod.